Well, that was abrupt. Music stop. Um, let's see, last time my volume was way jacked up in the beginning, so I think we've got it right now. Let me know in the comments if I don't, and I'm doing the best I can. Practice makes better, right? um, I've got 2 videos going, and it's freaking out my brain. Okay, because there's like a delay. I just wanted to make sure that I was live streaming correctly, that I was actually going to YouTube like it's supposed to. All right, well, with that, here we go. Hello. I'm talking about grant funding today for big projects and showing you the big project I've been working on that I funded with grants. Okay, so I'm Kristen Roach. This is CraftLeftovers Live, and thanks for joining me today, either right now in the moment, or maybe you catch this later, and that's just fine. I'm really happy you stopped by. Make sure to like, subscribe so you don't miss future live streams, and leave a comment. Let me know what you're up to. I want to see what you're making. Post about your creative business. I want to meet you. Anyway, yeah, I think that's it. I decided to just like down my intro, and here we go. And so today I just literally like threw out my notes onto the floor. There they go, whatever. We don't need them. Probably do, but whatever. Anyway, so today I'm going to be not mending, a little different. Instead, I'm going to be slaying my reed on my loom here. This is primarily just because, quite frankly, I'm on a deadline, and any chance I can get, I need to be working on this big project. And it is huge. I don't know if you can tell the scale of this thing, but oh my gosh, look at this loom. It's a beaut, isn't it? So first, today, I'm just going to tell you about my big project, and then I'll talk to you a bit more. Well, I want to show it to you. And then while I'm slaying the reed, I wanted to talk to you about grant funding and what that's like. I feel like in the art world or the fine art world, for those of you out there who have like BFAs, MFAs, that kind of thing, or in the nonprofit sector in general, you're going to understand the importance of grant funding. But as an individual artist, I think sometimes we lose sight of the possibility of grant funding to make these really big, wild projects happen that may not have like a necessary financial, they might not make financial sense. So last year, there was I always forget the name, but through the Iowa Arts Council, they offered a supplementary grant round for individual artists as well as art organizations. That was supplemental funding that came through the government, and it was a stimulus project to help be a catalyst for the arts. A lot of artists had their work really derailed, exhibit opportunities lost, art festivals just did not happen, or they had things lined up that then fell through because the organization shut down. I know some artists where they were planning on, they had been prepping this work for like a big gallery, and the gallery closed, right? It didn't make it through the shutdown. And then the other scenario is just that to make ends meet, or to do what you need to do to get through stuff, you took on other jobs that weren't necessarily in the studio. We saw this also in craft. Like in some sectors, there's huge booms. In other sectors, there was nothing. Like theater, I think, was hit super hard, or big institutional kind of art projects like installation works, performance-based works, where getting it in front of the public, like the public as a group versus just like, an individual painting to an individual buyer kind of scenario, or like selling your hand-dyed yarn to an individual person. Like there was a lot of growth in that area, but in the sense of like creating a large-scale project that then is going to be received in like a public arena, that really saw a hit. Anyway, so during the shutdown, I had been working on the Backyard Botanical series where I was painting gouache paintings of the plants in my backyard. Then also continuing work on my junk mail painting series, which actually I just finished another one. Let me go grab it for you. Okay, not quite finished, almost finished. I feel like I finished the hard part. Meet this sweet little Lincoln Sparrow. And funny enough, let's see if we can get in there. Yeah, there he is. I'm so excited about this one. I need to flesh in the background a bit. I'm not exactly sure how far I want to take the background in this one. So I'm just kind of like letting it sit on the easel and incubate for a little bit, which honestly for me, that's an important part of the process. So I feel like I get paintings about 90–95% done, and then I just kind of let them rest for a little bit, and then I come back with fresh eyes a couple weeks later to put those finishing touches on them. I feel like if I try to finish it all at once, it gets really, it just doesn't look as good. It just doesn't look as good for me. So I'm working on these birds, and in the process of working on these birds, I'm also filling out the portfolio pages on my online gallery, KristenMRoach.com, and I'm compiling the research that I've done on these individual birds into like blog post format. And there's a lot of data there, and I'm looking at all these migration maps, I'm looking at all these statistics, and I've really fallen in love with these 37 non-resident migratory songbirds that we see here in Iowa. And maybe part of it is just like, I want to share these birds with the residents of Iowa in a more impactful way. And I am through the paintings, which is really lovely, and it's, people seem very, they seem to resonate with them. But I wanted to take it a step further, and I wanted to convey the data, the breadth of the changes that have happened over the last 50, 70 years in the migration patterns, in the breeding grounds, and in the bird sightings. So, you know, I've done a lot of art projects. I don't know, I've done some pretty cool things, I think, over the years. But I've never done something this big. And to other artists who are further along, or maybe who just like jump straight into this kind of work, it's maybe no big thing. But for me, this is a big deal. Like, this is a super big deal, right? It's like doing your first triathlon. Like, now that I've done 9 triathlons, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm doing a sprint triathlon or an Olympic triathlon this summer. No bigs. I just got to put in the time to train for it, and I know I got it. Well, this is like a big, unknown, scary thing. This is like doing a first triathlon, but with like the art equivalent. And one of the big things that I did that I had to kind of like get over my fear is I actually contacted Cornell Ornithology Lab and requested access to their database of bird sightings. They have the eBird project, which is like the most comprehensive. It's like the most comprehensive database of bird sightings that they've compiled historic records. They're also taking on contemporary sighting data. It's like this huge feat of citizen science, which I love, because a lot of the data is submitted by people like you and me. Like, it's not necessarily scientists or official ecologists or anything like that, or ornithologists. It's like, it's you and me. And that is awesome. So I'm taking all this data, and I had this idea that I wanted to weave it, but I'm like, well, how do I make it change? Like, do I do tapestries for each decade? Like, for each bird? That doesn't quite make sense. And so as I was sitting in the studio, working on my paintings during shutdown, working on finishing some weaving projects I had going on, and really falling back in love with weaving, I came up with this idea. Okay, so I'm going to show you some pictures here. So this is just like, I made this slideshow for Open Studio, and we kind of project it and change it. So you can pause it and read it if you want. We're going to go back to that. I came up with this idea for this giant tapestry, and I'm calling it loosely something like migration mapping, or tapestry of migration, or migration tapestry, whatever. This is a little in flux still. And the idea is that you can go up to this and you can change the data. Like, you can change what is showing up. You can select date ranges, you can select birds. This first one is like the test. It's just the state of Iowa. But the idea is that I'm either going to make more that would, I'm going to either make more, kind of like grid out the United States, or not even the United States, grid out like the Americas, and do it that way. Or I'll make like one really, really big one. So the thing is that to make this happen, and so this is kind of like a mock-up of what it might look up. And then this is actually the test. So I dyed some warps on like my smaller loom. I wove up this piece, and I did some walnut staining and walnut warp painting. And this is kind of the process I'm going to be using as I'm weaving. And then we backlit it with LEDs, just kind of like as a test to see what the diffusion would be like, and if that would make sense for this project, and like kind of what yarn and warp and things like that I needed to get. Because diffusion is actually kind of a big issue, because we want it to like look luminous and not just like these hot points of light. And I'm using, and again, you can like, if you're really curious about this kind of more data-driven stuff, you can like read the slide later. But basically I'm using LiDAR maps to kind of, for the warp staining patterns, to represent the typography of Iowa, and like the plains region of Iowa. And then we're using the data from Cornell Ornithology's lab to Jason, my partner, is actually writing the program that's making this possible. And so he's creating a interactive, it's essentially like a web app that'll be on a tablet. And so then you can select the date ranges, and it will change the sequence of the heat map. And then it'll like, you know, it's going to be so cool. It's super intimidating. And it's big, like, okay, anyway, back to here. So this loom here, it had 4 harnesses and had some water damage, needed some parts replaced. It also is like 5 feet, almost 56 inches. It's 56 inches wide, and it now has a sectional beam, so I can use more tricky warps. And so it needed an upgrade. We thought we were just going to kind of like give it a little buff, like, oh, sand some rough spots and like revarnish it. We ended up completely restoring the thing. Like, we sanded it down and varnished like the whole loom. It took a lot longer than I thought. And in the midst of this, the parts just took a lot longer to get than we assumed. And so now it has 10 harnesses, which is so exciting. And I've wound the warp. I have threaded the heddles perfectly accurately. And now this is what's called slaying the reed, where you're putting these warp ends through the reed. And I'm using, for those weavers of you out there, this is an 8-dent reed, and I'm using 8 ends per inch. So that's why I felt confident doing it during this live stream, is because it's one warp end, one reed space. I feel, or one dent, I guess. So hopefully I won't mess it up. Anyway, and then, so this project, like, it's going to be about 4.5-ish feet wide, 20 or 30 feet tall, and walnut dyed, overshot pattern, and I cannot remember how many LEDs we ended up ordering, but it was a lot. Those things, plus needing to upgrade my loom, the cost is significant, you know, and like this is a project that came into my mind and I was like, I'll get this done eventually, right? Like I'll do it. But my timeline was more like 5 years. The idea was this year I would maybe buy the harness kits, and then next year I would get like the sectional beam, etc. down the line, and then eventually I would buy all the warp and then all the LEDs, you know, kind of budget it out over several years. And then just the time to do the project. So I work really good with external motivation. And basically that what that means is like if there's something else or someone else holding me accountable, even if it's kind of abstract. So like, for instance, one of the reasons CraftLeftovers, sorry. One of the reasons my business, Littlewoods, has done so well and has thrived for so long is that I have employees and I feel really accountable to those employees. If I don't get my work done, they don't have jobs. Like, that's pretty serious. And so like I show up even when I don't want to. And, you know, in the case of like working out and that kind of thing, which I really value, it makes me feel really good and helps my mental health a lot. Serotonin is wonderful. Give me that runner's high. But I'm terrible at working out every day. And so I do like a triathlon every year because it gives me a goal to work towards. Like I'm not going to be able to do that triathlon if I don't put in my base training during the winter and my more targeted training the 3 months leading up to the event. So art, it's very much the same way. Like I've definitely gotten better about building in regular habits, like drawing every day, that kind of thing. But I still really struggle with like making strides towards these really big projects that I have in me that are just, oh, I bumped my microphone, that I have in me that I'm just kind of waiting to get out. And, you know, those big dreams, right? And this project was like that. And I was like, okay, I will make this happen. But I know left to my own devices, it would be a really long timeline. It would eventually get done. But there's nothing like having an exhibit set up on the schedule to be a catalyst in the studio to get your work done and to show up every day for it. And so not really knowing where I'm going to show this yet, you know, a big barrier was like the financial side of it. It was really hard for me to justify the expense of this project because it's not, who am I going to sell a giant interactive Iowa specific migration tapestry project to? You know, like maybe 10, 15 years from now when I'm like super famous and everyone's going to want my work. Yeah. Okay. We've got dreams, right? You know, an institution would be like, yes, we're buying that, sign us up. But right now, like no one on that institutional level in the state or the region, they don't know me. They don't know my work. And so this is kind of like, I'm seeing this as like my debut into that world. And a great way to get legitimacy for the project versus just being like, I'm just working on this thing on my own in my own time because I want to, because I think it's going to be amazing, and you're going to think it's amazing once it's done, but you really have no idea what I'm talking about. Like, getting a grant for it, legitimizes it in a way that I can't on just my own word. I'm just not there yet. And I have friends who are there. I'm not there yet. I'll be there eventually, but it's just not where I am. So getting a grant, in addition to just like the financial component of like speeding up that timeline to make this project happen this year versus like 5 to 10 years from now, it gives it legitimacy so I can approach institutions and say, hey, I'm doing this project. I have an Iowa Arts Council grant. Let's show it in your space. Your patrons are the public and, the citizens of your area, your community is going to totally dig it. And so that's a big component of it, is like legitimacy, straight up finances, and having that external motivation. Because now, even though I have had a ton of setbacks with this project, I got the grant, and I think I got notice of getting the grant in like November or December last year, at which point I immediately like ordered my loom parts. I didn't get them until April. Yeah. And my timeline that I submitted with the grant was like, this project is pretty much going to be done in April, because I thought like 4 months. Yeah. And then it turns out there's a wool shortage. And so it took a really long time to get my warp. And then like it took a long time for there even to be a place that I could order the warp I needed that was in stock in the quantity that I needed it. And then the LEDs were going to be delayed. So it's like, which they like are just starting to show up. I don't think we have them all yet. And it's like, okay, well, here we are. But I have this grant and the report is due August, and I am going to get this project done before that point. And that's the thing with the external motivation, is like, if I was just doing this on my own, I'd be like, oh, all these delays, I'll get back to this in the fall, whatever. I might get a little down about it. And sure, like with all the delays happening, it stressed me out, it's getting me down, but I'm going to make it happen no matter what. Because that's the way I'm wired, I guess. Anyway, so this is that. And wow, it's already 2:22. Okay, so I think now, I don't know, what do you guys want to see? Do you want to see from this view? Maybe we'll just get going. I want to show you what I'm doing here. It's pretty neat, especially like for those of you who are not necessarily weavers. It could be fun for you to kind of see what this project is like. So I'm going to just flip it. We're going to zoom in. Oh, it wasn't that fancy. I'm trying to do something a little better every time. Okay, so this tool is what I used. Can you see that? Oops. This tool is what I used. It's like a really long stick to thread the heddles, which are in the harnesses. And previously I'd used this tool to thread my reed. In the process of ordering my warp and all this other stuff, I came across this tool, which is a little bit more, I think it's a little bit more specific for slaying the reed. And it's really great at just fitting right through. Uh-oh. Can you see around my hand? Maybe a little bit. Well, once I get going, you will, because I'll like move over this way and we'll angle it a little more. Anyway, so what you do is you grab, I'm gonna be a little reckless here. I'm gonna show you all of these harnesses just by popping this off here real quick. Watch this all go like horribly wrong. There we go. So I am just gonna lean this forward. So you can maybe see, maybe. Oh yeah, here's where it goes horribly wrong and it's gonna get funny. Okay, here we go. So you can see these are the heddles that I threaded, and I threaded them in sequence. And now that I've made this totally crazy, let's see if I can just nicely pop this back in here, get these warps out of the way. There we go. No problem. There we go. Okay. So I've bundled these in half of a pattern repeat, which is each pattern repeat, I believe, is 18 warps. So there's about 9 warps in each of these. And there we are. I'm using a 2-ply 100% wool warp. Now, one of the technical challenges of this project that I didn't think about when I first kind of envisioned it was that in some ways we are creating a giant, like we could be creating a potential heater, in the sense that we're taking a bunch of wire and LEDs and we're putting it into a big grid, and then we're wrapping it in a flammable thing, which would have been the case if we used cotton warps. Or like I had initially been thinking about using flax, like a flax linen warp. And Jason was like, "You're creating a heater." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you are correct." Because, you know, if you think about it, cotton is, or linen is what, you know, you'd make like a candle wick out of. It is definitely not flame retardant. So then I started looking into flame retardant materials, and it dawned on me that like wool is naturally flame retardant. So that was a big motivator in using wool warp. But wool warp can be a little trickier to find, and it's a little bit more expensive than like a standard cotton warp. And then there was also the question of like, what there was the question of like, what was the question? I don't know. Oh, what kind to get? Because, you know, there's all these different plies and weights. So I ended up going with this pretty thin 2-ply stuff, which I'll, you know, in the show notes, I'll put a link to the supplier that I used, which I was very impressed with. Once it was in stock, the speed of shipping, and they had like some warp calculator tools that were very handy and all that kind of jazz. And I believe I have enough of this to use as the weft as well. I might use a little bit of a mohair also. So the other thing to consider, which I mentioned earlier, was like the diffusion of the LEDs. And I thought that like using maybe a mohair inlaid with a, you know, a nylon thread or something like that would be the way to go. But what actually happened was when I wove with just like straight wool, it was perfect. Like it was absolutely perfect diffusion. I don't know if that's the right word. Diffuser, I guess. I don't know. It just makes me think of tea because a lot of times people come in and they'll say, I need a diffuser. And it's actually an infuser, usually, what they're looking for. And the terms are similar, but they're different. So yeah, so here we go. This whole process is like very methodical, pretty meditative at this point. When I was threading the harnesses, that was a lot more stressful because I have a deep paranoia that I'm going to misthread it and have to like redo the whole thing, which I've had to do on smaller projects before. But I learned my lesson, and I learned some really handy tricks for preventing that from happening. Mainly bundling them off and pattern repeats was a big deal. Okay, so back to grant funding stuff. So I'm not sure how many of you have... Oh, I'm already out of frame. All right, hey, I'm cruising right along. Great, because this needs to get done. I cannot wait to actually start weaving. This is like... I love this part of the process. I used to not, but now I do enjoy this a lot. But there's nothing quite like the magic of the fabric materializing through the process of weaving. And that is that's the part that I just love. And so I kind of can't wait to get there. Anyway, so several of my friends pretty regularly get grants. And like I said, grants are great for when it's something that you need some investment capital, so to speak, to get you the materials and funding to make the project happen. Grants can be really great at providing some external motivation to give you a little bit of a deadline. You're reporting to someone else, so like if you also operate that way, it's really wonderful. And what was the third thing? I felt like I had 3 points before. External motivation, finances. There was a third thing. It'll come to me later. Well, I already said it earlier anyway. I was just kind of recapping. So who cares? Okay, so the process for getting a grant is pretty similar. And you might ask, like, but how do I get these grants for my work? How do I know if I have a grant-worthy project? Well, the thing that I have found is that you don't really know until you try. But the best thing to do, I have found, is to just, read through the documentation and see if you even qualify. Like, that's always the big first step, is like, does your project even qualify? Or is there a way that you can kind of like subtly tweak it to qualify it? I would say, as a word of caution, don't just make a project to fit a grant. Unless you're like super passionate about the organization or the premise or whatever, like, that's not necessarily a great way to go. Teach his own, if that's what you like to do. But for me, I find it's better to have a specific project in mind and then shop for a grant that fits. So I'm actually going to apply for some other grants for this project later once I get it slightly further along. And instead of applying for art grants, I'm actually going to be applying for grants that are based on conservation education and that kind of topic. In Iowa, there's a lot of work being done on prairie restoration, on making and preserving green belts for migratory birds, so they have like continuous greenways going through our state. A fun, well, I don't know if it's a fun fact, but an interesting fact about Iowa is that we actually have, I think it's something like less than 5% of the land is what would be considered virgin land. It's all been cultivated in some form or another. And so what we have left is really precious. And we're trying to restore and reclaim certain sectors, so for both the wildlife as well as humans. Anyway, I see my project really fitting in nicely with bringing awareness to the concerns of like migratory birds, greenways, and how what we're doing is impacting migration. So for instance, a big premise of this project I'm working on surrounds this idea of disposable paper products like junk mail, dare I say it, toilet paper, paper towels, paper plates, all that kind of like just disposable paper products. Even like copy paper where you're pretty much just shredding and redoing. Anyway, a lot of that comes from the boreal forest region. And so through encroachment onto habitat, through like development, just, like urban spread, suburban spread, whichever, as well as deforestation related to harvesting trees for paper products, breeding grounds in the boreal forest are really diminishing. And as we see those diminishing breeding grounds up north due to deforestation, we're seeing less migratory birds in Iowa. So, and there's a lot of other factors coming into play, like Iowa's own changing landscape, as well as global warming. So maybe like birds aren't necessarily having to migrate as much, or they're like keeping to a more northern trend than they used to. There's a lot of factors. So not to like oversimplify the problem, but the idea of this project, which really just started out of a sense of curiosity of where does junk mail come from, and then led me to the Boreal Songbird Initiative. That's what started this whole thing. I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so at first, like, yeah, this is an art project, so look for art grants. So that's kind of the other thing is like, does your project have overlapping industries kind of coming into play? So, sometimes an education grant is going to make more sense, a conservation grant. For a previous project I did, is a mural in Campus Town. This is actually the first grant I ever got. It wasn't an art grant at all. It was a grant called Paint Iowa Beautiful, and it was an initiative to pay for the paint to basically spruce up buildings in historic districts around the state. And because the wall that I was working on was like a total crappy wall, and we were having to basically kind of like patch it and refinish it and seal it and all this jazz, and then paint the mural over it, so it was like a beautification project. I was able to get this grant that was not intended for art, but was absolutely applicable to the project I was doing. Now, in the case of this project that I'm working on right here, other kinds of grants that I might look at, so there's like grants about ornithology, education, conservation education. There's one like the Iowa DNR I'm looking into. If I'm willing to do programming with the grant, I could probably partner with local organizations who they themselves might have grant funding already to bring in programming that they could then pay out like an artist stipend or like a project rental fee or something like that. There's also grants for bringing public programming to small towns, like smaller communities. In the state of Iowa, we have this classification. Oh, what is it called? I'll link it in the show notes, but basically it's like for towns. Like it's like to bring art projects, cultural programming, revitalization efforts, educational projects to small communities that wouldn't necessarily have access to that kind of programming. So like, for instance, Ames just barely fits into this, but it's because we have like a land grant university. There's some other things. We're considered like an agriculture, and I think it's based around agriculture too. So it's like an agricultural small town classification. Anyway, so there's some things like that. There's also through like, so here in Iowa, and this might also be available in the state that you're in, is Main Street programming. So like if your project takes place in a historic main street that's accredited through the Main Street America program, there's potential ways you can get funding or consulting assistance from the state government. So like here in Ames, we have Main Street Ames, and that would allow, like if, there's all kinds of different projects and grants that are possible. But beyond even like the grants and like direct dollar for dollar kind of funding that's possible, there's a lot of really great like resources and connections that can come into play. And I guess that's the other thing about getting a grant too, is a lot of times the grant giving organization can open up some connections you might not have had access to otherwise. So for instance, with this project, one of the partnering institutions I was planning on working with may not be able to participate in the project anymore, so I have a gap in my schedule. And so my plan is next week I'm going to contact the coordinator for the Iowa Arts Council, who kind of oversees the grant project, and they're just amazing. And she kind of knows everyone in the state, and be like, hey, is there any way you could point me in the direction or like give me a connection to someone who'd be interested in this project and bringing it to their community? I've been pretty open with the fact that like, if you want this project about non-resident bird migration to come to your community, you really should just reach out to me and we can set something up. I'm pretty open. Like, Iowa is not a huge state. You can pretty much drive to any corner of Iowa within 3 hours, maybe 4 if there's not like a direct highway. And I'd be really interested in bringing it to your town. And because it is grant funded, the cost is pretty minimal. Like, just, I need a place to stay, please feed me, and if you could pay for my gas, awesome. Again, this is like one of those projects, like I'm not really planning on it being economically viable. I just want it to exist. And so I feel like for the first year, I am just gonna help it travel around. I'm just gonna help it travel around. So then that kind of makes me think of like another way you can look at grants too, is like one of the expenses of this project is going to be traveling it around, but it's things that you might not think about, like marketing it so the community that you're taking it to actually knows it's going to even be there. The other thing that would be helpful to fund is like the cost to build the crates, the cost to, like, while the grant is paying for the materials to make the project, it's not necessarily paying for, it's not necessarily paying to make the display that will make it like museum ready, which is like a whole different kind of art project. And so you can get grants for those kinds of things. Like you can get a grant to make it into a traveling exhibit and that kind of thing. There's also individual artist, almost like, there was like this art business accelerator grant that I applied to a while back. I didn't get it, but I guess that's the other thing is don't expect to get your first couple grants that you apply for. I was talking to some artist friends the other day, and I made the comment, we were talking about like juried shows, and I was like, yeah, I never really get into juried shows. And they were like, oh, really? And I was like, yeah, I applied for 3, I only got into 1. They're like, wait, you've only applied to 3 juried shows? And I was like, well, yeah. And they're like, you kind of get an F for effort there. You can't really expect to. I mean, it was ridiculous that I was even saying that I didn't really get into juried shows because I'd only, which it's like, okay, maybe I actually just haven't prioritized applying to juried shows. Like that's the real story there. But a lot of times what people say is that you're going to get maybe 5 to 10% of the grants that you apply for. And a lot of it just depends on the jurors, like the panel who's going through it, and they might be looking for something super specific or just have their own personal preferences, which is why panels change every year. And so like while your work might not resonate with one panel, it may resonate with another. And so like this is like a bit art specific, but the thing is like it can also apply to your craft business. Like for instance, something that I was thinking about doing in the past, I totally chickened out. Oh my gosh, it's something I would still like to do someday, but I'm just, maybe when I'm a little older. I'm just not there yet. But we have a women's prison here in Iowa that's not too far away, and I would really love to teach crochet or, like crochet or maybe tapestry weaving to the inmates there. And that's a project where the prison they can't afford to pay me. It's totally on my own dime. But that might actually make it like the perfect thing to try to get funded by some grants. And so it can apply to your craft business too. Like, is there something that you're really passionate about? Is there a group of people or a technique that you want to teach, to show, to share, to bring to a community that isn't really economically viable? Like maybe you want to teach high schoolers, and maybe the high school is really small and can't afford an art teacher. Is there a way that you could look to fund that project through some independent sources? And the other side of it too, as a business owner, is there's a lot of grants for business owners that I think a lot of times as solopreneurs, we do not even think about it. And so like as a woman, I can get a small business loan at a really low subsidized interest rate, which less of an issue right now because interest rates are still relatively low compared to, say, like when I was at college. But, you know, that's something to think about. Like, do you want to grow your business in some way? And could grants help you with that? Or going back to like, you know, the prison idea, if you have a real passion and a heart for people who are coming out of the prison system, you know, could you offer them employment? And there's subsidies and grants for that, which could help you offset the cost of payroll and things, which is hard, especially all the time. But there's oftentimes programs that if you employ someone who's on parole and you're teaching them a skill, you know, you're mentoring them, almost kind of like an internship, providing them with employment, you know, there might be some kind of work share that can happen. Or, you know, you might be providing them, depending on your business, you could be like helping them with community service hours. We actually had that at the art organization that I did, is that sometimes the docents would be people who needed to have some community service hours. Or sometimes the people who would they would come and, you know, we'd have projects like we just needed help, you know, we just needed extra hands. And so they would put in some community service hours that way. So like there's other kinds, that's not grants at all, but it's kind of like supplemental funding sources in a way, or financial assistance with things. We are just cruising right along. This is great. We got a bit way to go, but not too far. I think we're actually almost halfway done. Anyway, so, you know, what are your questions about grants? And leave some comments about what you're curious about. And I can, you know, in a future live stream, I can follow up and we can talk about that more specifically. I still can't think of what that third thing was of, you know, I'm just going to see if I can get this in a little closer so you can get a better angle of what I'm doing. I feel like my hands keep blocking what's going on. Yeah, I still can't think of what that third thing is. You know, finances, external accountability. I don't know. Anyway, oh yeah, so I didn't get the Business Accelerator grant through Artwork Archive, but in doing the preparation for that work, okay, this will segue into another thought. So in preparation, or by preparing that grant application, when this supplementary funding period, funding source, whatever, supplemental grant came up through the Iowa Arts Council, I was able to jump on it. It was like a really short turnaround. I found out about it, I think it was like within a week of the deadline. And I was able to submit it and I got it. And it's because I had applied for the Artwork Archive grant and I'd applied for the Artwork Archive grant and I had everything in order. I had my CV up to date. I had an artist statement. I had an artist bio. I had a project statement. I had images picked out and sourced. And so it was just a matter of kind of sprucing everything up. And I guess, so that segues into what I wanted to say next, and maybe this is kind of the final note, is that when you're looking for grants and you're writing a grant proposal for a specific grant, like you're creating a project for a grant versus finding grants for your project, you have to rewrite everything. I mean, maybe not like your CV, but even that, you're going to like spruce it up so it's geared towards, so it makes sense for the project. Like, so when I applied for the grant, that was bringing exhibits to our downtown community during the shutdown and dispersing that money to the artists exhibiting as a way to offset the impact of not having a market season. My CV, I focused on like community planning, my curatorial work, that I was a business owner, that I was on these boards of directors, you know, and had the connections, that I was the previous Main Street Ames president, things like that. Where when I submitted for this project, I focused more on my own personal exhibit, exhibit history. I focused on not so much community-oriented works, but I focused on the specific work that I created for that community project. So for instance, like, instead of talking about the Campus Town mural as a community mural that I coordinated, I talked about how I was the artist for that mural project. And it's just like a different spin. Anyway, so it's a different way to package the information that's going to make more sense to the organization to give you the grant. And so if you're having to like redo that for every grant you're submitting, because you're essentially generating projects for different grants, that is a lot of work. And then if you're only getting 10% of the grants you're applying to, it's like exponential. And so this way, like, you get all your information together, you get all your images, you get everything kind of geared towards this project, and then you can submit for multiple grants pretty quickly. And then that 10% acceptance rate doesn't sting so much, and it doesn't cost you so much in terms of your time and just like creative energy of like coming up with projects and things. It also keeps you focused on the project that you're passionate about, because like, that's what it comes down to, is like, yeah, the Iowa Arts Council is paying for the materials for this project, but they're not paying for my labor on this. Like, in this moment, like, there's other things that I'm saying no to that are negatively impacting my income. So I can make this project happen because I want it to. So yes, it's amazing to get a grant and to get like the materials paid for, but I'm not necessarily getting paid for my time. And that's pretty often the case in grants, is that like you don't get paid for administrative costs, or is like a very small percentage, like maybe 10% of the grant funding can go towards administrative costs. Anyway, I'm going to finish slaying this little section, and then we're going to bring the camera back around, and we're going to say goodbye, because it is 2 till 3. So I hope that, one, you're maybe a little bit excited about this crazy tapestry project that I'm doing, and that my random Instagram and Facebook and Twitter tweets, posts, etc. will make a little bit more sense now that you understand what all this weaving is happening for. I'm hopeful. It's also how it's connected to the birds I've been painting, and even just my deep love of the outdoors and walking in the woods. This morning, I had the most amazing experience. I was in the woods in Ames. I feel super fortunate that I can drive just like 5-10 minutes and be in an area that feels absolutely secluded. And, you know, I guess that's kind of another final notes, is you gotta find what fuels your fire. Like, what makes you feel like the creative genius that you are? For me, it's being in nature. It's drawing what's around me. It's connecting with the ecology that I'm in the environment that I'm in. And I love it so much. So for me, getting to spend the morning out in the woods and then come here and talk to you, I just feel so good. And the most amazing thing happened. Okay, we're switching it back around because I want to tell you about this most amazing thing. Whoa, crazy. Should have changed my view first. Sorry. Anyway, so here's this most amazing thing. I'm sitting on the stream or on the edge of a creek with Bob and I'm drawing. This is like my very favorite happy place, most content self ever. And I hear some rustling and I turn around and I'm like, what? Is that a deer? I'm thinking it's a deer because that's most common. It's not a deer. It was a coyote. Okay, Ames, Iowa, surrounded by farmland. And this tiny pocket, you know, I don't even know how many acres this section is. It's not a lot. And right in the center of Ames, and there's a coyote. It was magical. Anyway, so that was my crazy awesome thing that happened this morning. All right, I know I threw my notes. Now I'm going to grab my notes. Which now I cannot think of the word notes without thinking of Christina French being like, get your notes, girl. Anyway, that's it for today, okay? And thanks for coming out now or later. I'm really glad you did. And thanks for giving me the space to talk about these things that I'm so passionate about and share what little bit I know and my experiences. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review once this is in podcast form. It's really the best way to show what I'm doing some love and also share it with others out there who might need it. Oh yeah, don't forget, in about a day or so, check out the show notes and I'll post links to everything that I kind of mentioned, like, oh yeah, that'll be in the show notes. And sign up for the newsletter too, because you'll get inspiration about using what's on hand and thriving. Oh, I forget what I say. It's like living a sustainable, creative, or creating a sustainable business in life. That's what it is. I need to keep remembering that one. Anyway, until next time. Bye.